Top 10 American Serial Killers Who Predated the 20th Century. Serial killers, they're often thought of as a grim phenomenon of the modern era, a dark side of the 20th century and beyond. But the twisted minds behind some of history's most chilling crimes have been lurking for far longer. From vicious river pirates to cunning con artists, these murderers haunted the United States before the days of electric lights and fingerprints. Welcome to Creepshow, where we explore the darkest chapters in history. Today, we're diving deep into the top 10 American serial killers who predated the 20th century. Some of their names have faded into obscurity, but their chilling deeds still echo through time. Let's begin. Number 10. Samuel Mason. Years inactive: 1797, 1803. 20 verified, most likely more. Victims: originally a Virginia militia captain during the American Revolution, Samuel Mason was following the war. He lost his farm, went into debt, and angrily adopted a life of crime, leading a band of river pirates called the Mason Gang. He harassed the Ohio River Red Banks area. First, he drew visitors to a tent close to the river's bend. Mason waited until the next morning to pilfer from them if they had anything precious while they packed. Usually, he slaughtered them. Mason's actions by 1802 had earned him a $2,000 bounty on his head, and many volunteers seeking him. Spanish government officers in southeast Missouri finally arrested him. In Mason's possession, they found 20 human scalps and around $7,000 worth of different currencies. He escaped custody and ran to the protection of his gang before he could be hung for his crimes. But temptation turned out to be more worth than allegiance. To attempt to get the reward, two of Mason's buddies killed him and delivered his dead head to police. Both of them were identified as members of his gang and were hanged in 1804 instead. Number 9. Paddy Cannon. Years of active: 1820, 1829. 4 to 11 are the victims. Under the guise of runaway slaves, Paddy Cannon oversaw a gang of slave catchers who would deliberately enter places populated with liberated African Americans, capture them, and sell them back into slavery. She became quite nasty in this role and started to enjoy torturing others. Following a disagreement about appropriate remuneration for slaves, Cannon and her sons killed a number of slaves they thought entitled more than they had gotten. Shortly following this, Cannon and her group were captured and tried for murder, in addition to their crimes of kidnapping African Americans. At least 4 people thought Cannon killed personally. She was undoubtedly implicated in the killings of many more, though not by her own hands. Number 8. Samuel Green. Years active: 1817 to 1821. Victims range in numbers from 2 to 10 plus. Samuel Green came out of a difficult background. He was dispatched to live with a family acquaintance who would beat Green for any kind of misdeed. Beginning to vent his wrath on living entities, he stabbed farm animals and even drowned his pet dog in a well. These activities drove his caregiver to further chastise Green in the form of a whipping so strong it flayed the skin from his back. Having gone broke only a few years after moving out on his own, he chose to start a crime spree all throughout New England. He broke into homes and clubbed to death anyone unfortunate enough to be in attendance during his theft. Following a years-long run of murder, rape, and theft, he came to be known as Public Enemy Number 1, the first in national history. At last, he was taken into custody in Danvers, Massachusetts, under burglary charges. Although he was moved to a Boston prison, his violent behavior persisted. He made several tries at escape, but was always stopped. In one such case, a prisoner alerted Green's guards of his intentions. Green confronted the prisoner in the prison workshop after learning of this treason and battered him to death with an iron rod. Samuel Green's many murders resulted in a death sentence at last. April 25, 1822 saw his execution via the gallows. Some sources state April 24, 1822. Number 7. Edward Ruloff. Years of activity: 1844, 1870. 3 to 5 are the victims. Edward Ruloff most definitely matches the contemporary conception of the sophisticated serial killer. Higher educated, he was driven by his ego and need for control. He had already run afoul of the law in his native Canada, serving 2 years in jail for theft, by the time he relocated to Dryden, New York, to study herbal medicine. He met his future bride in New York, a 17-year-old cousin of his professor, and the two were married. Ruloff was a manipulative, nasty, and jealous man, it became soon clear. Still, the two later produced a daughter. Ruloff's wife and daughter vanished without any trace less than a year later. Ruloff was seen driving a wagon with a trunk in the rear to a local lake about the time they vanished. He was eventually taken under custody, but he was merely accused with kidnapping and condemned to 10 years in jail without any bodies that could be generated as proof. Later on, he was told he will be tried for killing his daughter and wife. Ruloff chose to just get out of prison after some legal wrangle on whether it would be double jeopardy to try him once more. Eventually, he changed his name, relocated to another area of New York, and went to small-time criminality. After a failed heist in Binghamton, New York, in which he killed a store employee, he was at last apprehended. Ruloff's identity was found following his detention. He was hung in 1871 following a well-reported trial. Though some sources claim Ruloff was the last person hanged in New York State, honor belongs to John Greenwall, who passed away in 1889. Number 6. John D. Carr. Years active, middle of the 1860s and 1869. Victims range in numbers from 1 to 15. 1846 saw the birth of Thomas Carr in West Virginia. He joined the Union Army during the Civil War at age 15 in order to flee his violent father. Carr started courting a 13-year-old local girl named Louisa Fox, also Louisa Fox, while he was a coal miner in Ohio in 1869. Carr was 10 years older than Louisa, yet her parents first approved of his courting proposition. Then they started to hear accounts of Carr's history of mood swings and violent outbursts. Carr waited for Louisa as she headed home when he learned the engagement was called off. Carr went over to the small child, planted a kiss on her lips, and then straight razor-cut her throat. He then went back to his house trying to kill himself. Not able to do so, he was taken under custody the following day. He admitted in detention of killing Louisa and another 14 individuals previously in his life. March 24, 1870 saw Carr executed by hanging. Number 5. Lydia Sherman. Years active, 1864, 1871. 11 are the victims. For most of her life, Lydia Sherman was a housekeeper and caretaker. She was anything but, even beneath a naive and protective front. Lydia married men, had her wills modified in her favor, and then inherited their money following their unexplained illness and death. Her first marriage claimed the lives of her husband and their 6 children, all of whom died from unidentified diseases, at the time ascribed to typhoid fever. Later on, the dead were discovered to have been arsenic-poisoned victims. Her second marriage resulted in the death of just her old wealthy farmer and fisherman's spouse. Her last marriage produced deaths for her spouse and his 2 children from previous marriage. She said in her confession that she had only meant to poison her stepchildren, and that the death of her last spouse was unintentional. Lydia fled jail, but less than a year later she was discovered. She fell quite sick several months after her captivity. May 16, 1878 saw Lydia Sherman die in prison. Number 4. Jesse Pomeroy. Years active, 1871-1874. 2 victims. Born in Charlestown, Massachusetts, Jesse Pomeroy, 1859. His right eye was deficient, hence he was bullied even as a small child. It disgusted many people who met him and covered his pupil totally with white film. Pomeroy suffered constant bullying as a result. He started then attacking and torturing anyone around him who were smaller or less strong than he was. His family migrated to South Boston in 1872. 2 years later, he killed a 4-year-old lad and placed his disfigured body in a swamp near Dorchester Bay. Authorities connected Pomeroy to the crime using tracks left close to the body that matched exactly his boots. He came clean once he was caught. He even said he buried a 10-year-old girl behind an ash heap and killed her the previous March. Pomeroy found guilty and condemned to death. At the time, Pomeroy was only 14, hence the Massachusetts governor denied to approve his execution warrant. He lived in prison for the next 58 years, until his death in 1932 at 72. Number 3. Stephen D. Richards. Years of active participation, 1876–1878. Targets, 9. Known later as the Nebraska Fiend, Stephen D. Richards was born in West Virginia about 1856. Though he originally claimed to have been born in 1836, he seemed to be in his early 20s when he passed away in 1879. Most approximations place his birth in the middle of the 1850s. He grew up mostly in Ohio. Until working at the Iowa Lunatic Asylum in Mount Pleasant, Richards led a quite quiet existence. After he was assigned to work in one of the most violent wards in the hospital, he lost much of his sympathy for mankind. Richards started his Midwest journey. He started negotiations in 1878 with a woman of 3 hoping to buy her Nebraska land. He chose to murder the entire family and bury them in a mass grave before the sale was settled upon. About a month later, he also hammered a neighbor dead. Richards was caught not long afterward. Along with 4 from the past 2 years, he admitted to these killings. He was sentenced to death in 1879 after turning down legal assistance. A reporter spoke with Richards just before his death. This gave the public most of the insight into his warped thinking that is accessible today. Number 2. Carl Feigenbaum. Years active, 1888–1894. 1 verified, most likely more victims. Carl Feigenbaum presents an interesting case. He was not a killer born in America. He was, instead, a sailor born in Germany. Still, it was in the United States where he was found guilty of killing his landlord. Jack the Ripper, who is thought of as one of the most infamous serial killers of all time, makes him significant in the annals of history. His lawyer came first in suggesting this. Following Feigenbaum's execution in 1896, his attorney claimed that he had admitted to having committed the well-known atrocities in London. The hypothesis of the Ripper being a merchant or sailor has acquired popularity recently. It offers a justification for his lack of capture, as well as for the abrupt cease in killings. One can argue whether Feigenbaum was Jack the Ripper or not, but his lawyers and the cops who caught Feigenbaum suggest that he very certainly killed additional people abroad. Feigenbaum would be almost tough to link, though, to those crimes. Number 1. H. Holmes. Years of active participation, 1891–1894. Victims range in numbers from 9 to 27. Originally a con artist and scammer, H. Holmes finally turned into a killer about the early 1890s. He was quite skilled in fooling people into believing him and providing anything he needed to execute his most recent deception. Moving to Chicago under the name H. Holmes, he became a pharmacist in 1886. Herman Mudgett, his real name, was far less appealing, hence he adopted a pseudonym. Driven to kill, he did not commit murder. He did it instead for financial gain. Apart from luring women, acquiring possession of their belongings, and subsequently murdering them, Holmes obtained life insurance policies on some of his staff members and gathered the proceeds upon their untimely death. His so-called murder castle was the most well-known feature of his killings. Holmes said he was building it for Chicago's 1893 World's Columbian Exposition for usage as a hotel. The upstairs was an assembly of halls and rooms. Others disappeared. Some chambers, however, have chutes leading to the basement, where his victims' remains were dissected and disposed of, including in vats of acid. At last, Holmes was apprehended and hung in 1896. Although he was formally connected to just 9 killings over his career, nobody is sure exactly how many victims died in the hotel. Although some estimates place the count at around 27, the number of victims was most certainly far greater. These killers walked among us during a time when forensics was a distant dream, and justice often meant frontier-style retribution. The crimes they committed are buried in the past, but their stories continue to fascinate and terrify us. From sinister schemes and gruesome murders to the macabre details that leave us shuddering, history proves that the monsters of our nightmares have always been real. If you enjoyed this journey into the shadows of the past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more bone-chilling tales from Creepshow. Until next time, stay curious and stay cautious.